This podcast focuses mostly on historical context, and I'm going to go into a bit of detail about what the witches are in relation to their role in the story and in relation to what people believed at the time this play was written. Now, the first thing to note here is that the witches' role in the story as prophets is very different to contemporary folklore about witchcraft at the time. Their role as prophets goes way back. It's closer to the kind of things that appear in ancient Greek literature, and I'm specifically thinking of plays like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, which, like Macbeth, starts out with a character receiving a prophecy, with a couple of key differences. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, the character who receives the prophecy tries to flee from it, whereas in Macbeth, rather than trying to flee from it, Macbeth tries to take control of it and tries to make it work for him and tries to select which parts of it come true and which parts of it don't. So Shakespeare takes some themes that go way, way, way back and starts to apply them to more contemporary belief in witchcraft. And it's the way Macbeth tries to pick and choose which parts of his destiny come true that brings up this theme of destiny and fate that's quite important to what contemporary audiences would have believed about Christianity. So around this time, the late 16th, early 17th century, there was an increasing debate about whether witchcraft was actually real. There'd been lots of books written about it. Possibly most famous is the Malleus Maleficarum from 1486. The title translates as Hammer of the Witches. And it's a legal text about how to prosecute witches. It is absolutely certain that witches exist and that they interact with people in the real world and that there needs to be a legal framework to deal with them. But by the time of King James and Shakespeare, the 17th century, there's more and more scepticism beginning to appear about witchcraft. And there have been other books written by people like Johann Bayer and Reginald Scott that argue that witchcraft is real, but that it doesn't manifest in real people. So they never denied that witches and the devil were real, they were Christians, but they felt that people who believed to be witches, or people who were manifesting behaviours that would have been interpreted as witchcraft, were more likely to be either lying or mentally ill. But King James I, who was on the throne of England at the time the play was written, was an absolute believer in witchcraft. And he wrote another famous text called the Daemonologie, which was his way of proving that witches did actually exist and the skeptics were wrong. So the Daemonologie is written as a dialogue. It's written almost as a play script between two characters called Philomethes and Epistemon, and they debate and discuss the nature of witches and what witches are. And in so doing, a case is argued that witches really exist. Now, in the course of the argument, King James follows the standard Protestant beliefs of the day, which are very different to the Catholic beliefs that had come before them. And they have to do with fate and destiny and whether or not you can escape it. And the imagery he uses is quite similar in some respects to the lines the witches have in Macbeth. So as an example, in Act 4, Scene 1, the witches are brewing a potion in their cauldron, and they list among the ingredients body parts, among other things. And it reminds me of a section from the Daemonologie that reads, "As for little trifling turns that women have ado with, he causeth them to joint dead corpses and to make powders thereof, mixing such other things there amongst as he gives unto them." Now, I'm not trying to argue here that Macbeth is directly influenced by the Daemonologie. I suspect that's unlikely. It's possible the Daemonologie had been written a couple of years before Macbeth was. But I think it's more likely that both Shakespeare and King James I are taking their imagery from common folklore. They're both drawing from the same well. Now, to go back to a point I mentioned earlier, I just want to use a quotation from the Daemonologie as a way of illustrating the concept of predestination, which is quite alien to people who've not really been brought up in a strictly Protestant tradition, but which was widely agreed upon among Christians, or specifically Protestant Christians of Britain at the time. So Epistemon at some point says, "No man ought to presume so far as to promise any impunity to himself, for God hath before all beginnings preordinated as well the particular sorts of plagues as of benefits for every man, which in the own time he ordains them to be visited with." Now, predestination is a core belief of strict Protestantism, and it essentially says that God has decided in advance what happens to every soul. So whether or not you go to heaven or whether or not you go to hell has nothing to do with your own character and your own behaviour, but instead it is decided before you're even born, before the universe is created. So the Protestant belief was that salvation was only possible through God's grace. That God would choose to allow you into heaven regardless of whether or not you wanted it, regardless of how much you prayed, or regardless of how much good you did. The Protestants would have denied that it's possible to get into heaven solely through good works. So this seems to be a very, very anti-free will idea. In fact, it would argue that free will itself is blasphemous, because if a person has the free will to do something that isn't what God wants, then that would mean that God is not all-powerful. Which brings us to the character of Macbeth himself, and specifically the way he tries to choose which parts of the prophecy come true and which parts don't. So, following this logic, this strict Protestant belief, Macbeth can't choose which parts of the prophecy come true. It's out of his hands. And indeed, as the play goes on, every part of the prophecy comes true. Macbeth is not successful in his attempt to allow parts of it to happen and stop other parts. So this quotation from Act 3, Scene 1, "For Banquo's issue have I filed my mind, for them the gracious Duncan have I murdered. Rather than so, come fate to the list, and champion me to the utterance." He is directly challenging fate. He's almost daring fate to challenge him. And the point here is not only that it's completely impossible, which is what the ancient Greeks would have thought regarding a play like Oedipus Rex, not just that it's impossible, but that it's blasphemous, because by challenging his fate, he challenges the power of God to decide his fate. That in turn implies that he would still be a blasphemer, even if he wasn't a murderer. Murder is just the cherry on the cake in terms of the sins he's committing. Even if it wasn't for that, he's still denying God's power. So in that regard, Macbeth is doomed right from the word go. Right from the moment he attempts to take control of the prophecy, he has blasphemed, he has committed a mortal sin before he's killed Duncan. So, the witches appeal directly to the beliefs of King James I. There was growing scepticism at the time. King James I was not a skeptic, he was a believer. And the themes of fate and destiny that they bring up, not only do they go back thousands of years, but they tie directly into Protestant beliefs of the time. In that regard, Shakespeare is modernising ancient themes. And by attempting to take control of his own fate, Macbeth adds to the blasphemy of his actions. He's committed a blasphemous sin anyway, in the sense that murder is prohibited in the Bible. But he's a murderer who defies the power of God to control his fate.